I'm Jim Czek. You're watching Now Media. With me, Gavin, Kelowna Mission MLA, and also Shadow Minister, the Jedi Shadow Minister for Jobs, Economic Development, Innovation. Did I miss anything?
Nope, you got it all, Jim.
There you go. But we're talking right now today, the big story in Kelowna, I guess we'll even back that up a bit. The big story in British Columbia has been this healthcare crisis where we had small hospitals, Lillooet, with ER closures time and time again, Oliver, 100 Mile House, we can go on and on, the list is long. And those closures usually didn't start happening till later in the year, but they started early this year, including Merritt and all those different places. And they've started earlier, and I guess the government found a way to kind of ignore them a little bit because, they're kind of like more rural. But now we have like the largest hospital in the interior here that also serves a bigger community of 250,000 and doctors are speaking out with a pediatric crisis here. I think first it was like 7 or 8 doctors that wrote a letter, and then all of a sudden 130 doctors or healthcare professionals come forward and supported them. So it's hard for the NDP to ignore this. And I would even say the extra cost, because they're now referring patients to Vancouver or different places. So if you have a little one that you have to take it in the hospital, also now adds a financial burden to the parents, because now how do you visit? And the whole family loses connection too, because maybe one parent goes there, incurs some extra costs. But it really makes it hard for the whole family unit to be visiting that child in a time of crisis. And I guess the question to you is, you've been talking to a lot of people. What are you seeing, and what solutions do you think need to be put into place?
Jim, you're absolutely right. It is a crisis. It has been a crisis for some time. I think that what's different here is a couple of things. The first is that the media, the public, decision makers are really starting to tune in and to recognize that, as you rightly pointed out, this is a crisis that is starting earlier in the year than it has before. It's in a major hub serving 250,000 people, acting as a referral hub for 1 million. The knock-on effects are really significant in that what we're seeing both within Kelowna itself and also in the region is that all of our defense in depth, if you will, seems to be breaking down. So we're falling back to our plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D for all of these areas of treatments. And we're doing so even before we begin the post-school higher risk summer months, where we have a significant infusion of tourists who are coming to Kelowna and the surrounding area who are going to require healthcare, whether that be emergency or not. People that have not planned on having a baby in Kelowna, but end up doing so. All these different things are going to be hitting us really hard, and it's very clear that the system is under tremendous strain, if not collapsing. And I would say what's really different here is the extent to which frontline healthcare workers are standing up and either anonymously or with their names behind it are sharing this information with the public, because they are deeply concerned that the information is not making it out to the public. They are clearly not being heard. They are clearly not being listened to by this NDP government and by Interior Health.
Yeah, and I guess, the doctors, they typically don't speak out. And it was that one young female doctor that actually spoke up first on social media. She put out that piece there. And I thought, well, she's going to get in trouble for that one. And then all of a sudden that letter showed up, and then more support showed up. So it's really hard to go after one doctor, 7 doctors, when all of a sudden it's a lot of doctors and nurses and that are now starting to speak out and saying something needs to be fixed. And then I watched the NDP say that they were going to reach out to to Washington and Oregon and stuff like that to try and get some doctors and nurses there. And I look at that, and I thought, well, how is that going to work? You're asking people to come here for half the pay, double the taxation, and it's a hassle to come here. And it seems like to the NDP and the Liberals, I would say everything seems to be politically motivated. They think everybody's very political, that everybody's trying to escape Trump or something like that. But most people are just trying to get their lives together. And wouldn't it be better to spend that effort on something that would bear more fruit? Because we tried to ask them too. They spent that money in the UK trying to recruit doctors. We asked how many doctors they got for that and how much they spent. They said they didn't have the information. We did an FOI about a month ago. Still no information.
Yeah, Jim, there's a lot embedded in your question there. So first off, let's talk about that lack of transparency and the kind of cherry-picked numbers. I want to give you an example from budget estimates that we went through recently. My colleague, Brennan Day, who is one of our healthcare critics, repeatedly asked Josie Osborne, the Minister of Health, around the number of new doctors in the system. And she insisted and continues to use the number 1,001. How many new doctors? 1,001. He asked her for like an hour, how many left the system? It was 660. So the number of new doctors, net new doctors actually coming into the system was actually 440, 44%, the government's original claim. And that doesn't begin to take into account the per capita number of doctors, because we've seen rapid population growth and we're not even keeping up with that. So there does seem to be this constant desire to cherry pick numbers that sound as good as possible by government without actually taking into account the numbers we should be looking at if we're trying to fix the system. To your point around doctors in the States, yes, government has made a very big deal about how it's advertising, and folks practicing in the United States are apparently all going to come to BC because of the politics. But as you rightly pointed out, Jim, there's a major difference in compensation. There's a major difference in cost of living. It is a pretty fundamental proposition. Having 600 people fill out a form saying they could maybe be interested, that's an input. That's not an output. So there just does seem to be this constant politicization of the numbers. And I would add to that, Jim, especially from having talked to a number of doctors in the last few days who are right at the front lines of this, it seems as if the government is determined to replace doctors that are here in our community and in our system rather than retain those doctors. So there has been seemingly just this broken culture, a lack of listening, a lack of hearing, a lack of effort into retention. So you've got a very frustrated cohort of doctors. In the case of pediatrics, we've got 20 pediatricians in Kelowna that are declining to work at KGH because of the working conditions and the risks that they feel they face there. So even if you can persuade folks that are working in the States for more money and a lower cost of living to take a look at moving here, I want to quote something that a doctor said to me just yesterday, which is that you can't hire into a broken culture. A doctor who's thinking about moving here has Google. They can look online and they can see what's happening in the system. And it is clear that in the system, those frontline workers are not being respected. They're not being retained. They don't feel they're being heard when they're offering constructive solutions to make the system better. And I can't see a reason why someone would willingly choose to work in a broken culture. So we've got to fix the culture and fix the leadership. And that starts from the Minister on Health and the Premier on down.
Yeah, it seems like getting those 20 pediatricians back into the hospital would seem like the easiest path, or your best, where you need to best deploy resources. How do we get them back in there? So what's the hurdles? Because they're here. Because moving from the United States, and I was offered a job in Houston once, moving countries is a really big deal. You got to change everything, your license. Plus, you got to leave your family, you got to leave your friends, you got to pull your kids out of school. And then the taxation law, and then there's exchange. There's a whole bunch of things that's very, very hard to convince somebody. It's like, when a business is dealing with a bank and another bank tries to court you, really hard to get people to change because there's a lot of work involved in it. And it seems like they're spending a lot of energy on something that will bear little fruit, and then they won't even share the information on when they already went out there and spend money in the UK. Why not just tell us what you got for that spend and how much we're spending in the United States on that, where we could better deploy those assets, because we know that money is a finite resource as well. And so what are we getting for that spend other than to get to stand at the podium and say we had, 600, 400, 600 people fill out a form, which could have been a bot for that matter. You know what I mean? Like, how do you even know what you get out of it? Because not until you get a closed deal where somebody actually shows up. One of the things that, even, and I know from personal experience, there's nurses that have worked in BC and Alberta at the same time, but they have to pay fees in Alberta and they have to pay fees in British Columbia. Why not make it easy for them? Because some of those nurses would actually probably pick up shifts here in Kelowna, and that if they could do that back and forth without having to pay the $1,500 in fees there and another 15, I don't know what the number is, maybe 1,200, 1,500.
Well, GM, that is such a perfect example of why labor mobility matters and why it's so shocking that when the NDP brought forward Bill 7, which was their Tariff Response and Economic Stabilization Act, one of the things they explicitly carved out of it and would not talk about was labor mobility. They don't even want to talk about it.
That seems to be the easiest thing to do. That seems to be the easiest piece of fruit on the tree to me. Like, I think maybe they're missing the mission. The mission is to get pediatric care here in Kelowna, or ER care in Lillooet. You know what I mean? Like, the people of Lillooet, it just blows me. We talked to the mayor there, and they don't want to talk because they're scared they don't get nothing. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're scared to rock the boat.
Exactly. So 2 points there, Jim. The first is what I think we continue to see from this government is a focus on hiding problems versus fixing them, and we continue to see a focus on political posturing over actual solutions. So, micro example, we've talked before about distilleries in BC. This government made a big deal, a big announcement about taking Red State liquor off BC liquor store shelves. They told BC distillers that they would get BC product on shelves. And months later, they still haven't got the job done because it's all about the posturing, not about the actual delivery. To your point around that fear, around those local governments who are concerned about whether they'll just get nothing if they speak out against this government. My email inbox, my text messages, my phone in my office have been blowing up over the last week, especially from frontline healthcare professionals who are frankly fearful of the system they work in. They feel unheard. There is, to quote one doctor directly, a culture of fear. To quote another, a fear of retribution. To quote another, leadership is authoritarian. So these folks are genuinely fearful of speaking out within their own work environment. Well, we need to fix the healthcare system, and we're not going to fix the healthcare system unless we rebuild trust and reopen communication and start actually taking seriously the highly trained frontline professionals who know exactly what is happening in the hospitals and facilities that they work in. And as it stands, it's clear that many of those people feel as if to speak up is to be shunned or shut down, rather than being able to offer constructive solutions, to feel heard, to see those solutions implemented, and to be part of changing our system for the better. So we clearly need a change in direction and tone and leadership that starts at the top with the Premier, with the Minister of Health, and all the way down through health authority leadership.
Well, that fear is warranted because we've seen what happened to some of the doctors and nurses that spoke up during COVID. And so for them, like you speak up, you get whacked. And I can see that. But that's why I'd say it was really good to see that young doctor speak up. And then, just like, oh no. And then all of a sudden, like that letter came, and then all of a sudden even more support came, and it's tough to whack everybody, right? You know what I mean? But I'd say one of the bigger things, and I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second here, is access to ask questions. Like media outlets, the NDP won't do interviews. We just reached out and asked for an interview with Brenda Bailey. And I've interviewed Brenda Bailey in the past when she was running, when they were running for re-election, they did the interview. But then she's in town here, asked for an interview. I'm a CPA. I have a finance background, so I thought it'd be a great interview. They said they'd look at it, and then they said, oh, there's no time. And so then we sent another email and said, well, anytime, like you just did. I send you a thing, and you say, yes, let's do it. And they say there is no time in the future. Well, what does that mean? So they don't want to talk to media. They don't want to talk to us, for sure. And we send question after question.
They sure don't want to talk to us in the opposition.
Yeah.
But it's clear that, frankly, this government views democracy as an inconvenience. That's why they tried to ram through Bill 7, Bill 14, Bill 15, all of which are autocratic, all of which do away with democratic oversight in the legislature, all of which do away with the ability of public and elected officials to ask questions of what this government is doing. They seem to think that democracy and accountability are beneath them, or they seem to think that they're just managing a system and that there isn't supposed to be democratic oversight. And I think that that's obviously a very dangerous way of doing things, both within the healthcare system, but also more broadly in a democracy.
You would think, and I was a good interview with Brenda Bailey in the past, and you would think the finance minister would welcome an interview with a CPA that knows the language and could talk. And, I interviewed David Eby. So this non-access to them, and like I say, like we've asked time and time again for information from the different ministers. Adrian Dix was a case in point. We could ask till we turned blue for information from Adrian Dix. He just would not respond to anything. And the same thing goes right now. Like, why do we have to do an FOI, and why does it take over a month to even get that information? It's just ridiculous. It's past ridiculous. Like, tell us how much money you're spending and what you're getting for it, because there's better ways to spend that money. And maybe if you want to really have a sit down and start talking to people, even the Conservatives, like you say, because maybe there's a solution in there somewhere.
I think you're right on that, Jim. Like, it's, look, I'm obviously a new MLA. I'm not new to politics, but I'm new to being an elected official. And for me, you're a CPA, I'm an MBA, I come from business. And what I've tried to do in the legislature is to ask constructive questions that flag issues or flag dynamics or flag risks in terms of the unintended consequences of legislation. We've done that time and time again, whether it be on consumer protection, whether it be around some tariff response pieces, whether it be around, what the kinds of market signals we're sending with different legislation is. And I just don't get the impression that the government is interested in hearing that perspective. There's a quick rush to an ideological position where, for example, on Bill 4, which is the Consumer Protection Act, we pointed out some unintended consequences for small business. And when we pointed out the fact that there'd be virtually no consultation whatsoever with small business on an act with massive sweeping consequences for small business. And you'd think the response would be a willingness to go and do that consultation, or a receptiveness to the fact that we're identifying a specific tangible issue that could have unintended consequences. Instead, we get cabinet ministers standing up on the other side of the house and accusing us of being shills for big business because we're pointing out the unintended consequences that thousands of small businesses will be left with because of legislation that was simply not thought through, was not consulted on, was not evaluated against whether it would actually accomplish what it set out to accomplish without having undue costs and consequences that negatively affect small business while doing nothing to actually help with consumer protection.
There's a coldness to what this is because it lacks empathy. Because again, if you just think of the family that has to take their child into the hospital in a pediatric ward, and they're told that they can't be serviced here, that they have to go to Vancouver or wherever. They go to Vancouver.
Forget about the child that actually does. I mean, look, I got a 6-year-old with a 7th birthday coming up soon. Happy birthday, Abby, and a 4-year-old. And it's not just about when you actually go into the hospital. It's about not knowing that the healthcare system is going to be there for you and your child and your family when you need it. That might be when you're about to give birth. That might be when your child is sick. There's nothing more stressful and more emotional for a parent than their child going through a health issue, and to not know whether you're going to be able to get care when you need it is a tremendous emotional and psychological burden for parents. That's why, this news that's broken over the last few weeks, it's been blowing up every, parent WhatsApp group and Facebook group, for weeks, because people are really concerned about not being able to rely on our healthcare system, or not being certain they're going to be able to get care close to home where their support network is, instead of being asked to go an hour away or 4 hours away and being disconnected from their extended families and support networks. That's just it's not acceptable, and it's not the healthcare system that we're all paying for and expecting our government to deliver.
Yeah, it separates the family unit, like you just said, that support network, because then maybe one parent can only go because they got to have jobs. It adds extra costs. But the biggest thing is the emotional distress that it causes the child that's already in a hospital. and is scared, and then they can't be around their family unit that could come and visit them. And I think that's where I think this whole problem lacks empathy. And the same thing goes for people in Lillooet that have been told time and time again that they're going to have to go to Kamloops, and even in the winter, we're going to drive over a pass that may or may not be open or may have an accident on it, that you have to go to, drive 2 hours to get healthcare. This is Canada. This is not a third world country. And should be a basic service that's available to all Canadians. And I think we're missing the point. And it all comes back, and I'm going to say it comes back to the jobs and economic development. It comes back to the economy. If we are flush with cash and had tons of money and the province was going well, we would be attracting professionals here because there would be enough to pay them, enough to go, like everybody would be happy. The economy is in kind of like a spiral downwards. With escalating debt. We got a lot of people really scared about losing their jobs, losing their business, and we have all these no birds or boo birds whenever we talk about we could do this and this and this on projects. And we just heard the First Minister's had a meeting. Daniel Smith wants a pipeline to the west. And then the only thing that was said by British Columbia, not during the meeting, but right after the meeting, that they're not interested in a pipeline going west.
Yeah, Jim, I mean, you just absolutely nailed it on the economic piece, right? As the critic for jobs, economic development, and innovation, and as someone who comes from business, that's always my focus. In part because I believe in business. I believe that business and economic growth is a positive end into itself, but also because I know you can't pay for government from nothing, right? Money doesn't grow on trees. There's no such thing as as government dollars. There's only taxpayer dollars. So we have to create a strong economy that lets us pay for those services. What we've had over the last 8 years with this government is we've had a 41% increase in the size of the public sector, and the private sector has been virtually flatlined in terms of job creation. So we've got a bigger and bigger and bigger government perched on the back of an anemic economy, and we so desperately need to be able to pay for a strong healthcare system. Heck, we've seen massive growth in the amount of employment in the healthcare system, but we're just not seeing delivery in terms of having a system that people can count on.
How do we get more information? Because it is, and I used to work with government. I remember talking to one of the ministers, and her advice to me always was, when there's a problem, Jim, just get out a flashlight and shine a light on it. The rats will scurry, and that'll get you the answer you want. But they're not allowing us to shine lights on them. They're not allowing us to get the information. Like I say, and I've asked the Conservatives before too. Like, can I get the information on how many doctors were gotten from the UK? And they said, well, we can't get that information. Like, if you can't get it through an FOI, or the FOI may come whenever they get around. Like, there's got to be more than one person working in that department because, like you just said, they keep adding to administration. Yet they don't seem to want to give them. Who's giving the orders there to be really slow with FOIs? And why is the minister not providing that information? Why are they dragging their feet? And how come you can't get that information?
Those are all really good questions, Jim, right? I mean, coming from business, what gets measured gets managed. And it's really important, I would argue, as someone who wants to continue to see our systems of service delivery and government get better, it's important we're able to have honest conversations about what's happening. So when what we get in terms of numbers from the ministry is, cherry-picked numbers that paint a rosy picture, that's all well and good if you're just trying to do political spin, but we need to actually talk in terms of numbers that can drive improvement. We should be talking about net growth in the number of doctors. We should be talking about doctors and nurses per capita. We should be talking about numbers that are actually meaningful in terms of measuring progress. But it seems as if this government is allergic to measuring progress and allergic to measuring performance, or they think that you and I don't have a right to know what's happening in the system that we're paying for. So that, again, is going to require, I think, a top-down change in culture. It's going to require a top-down change in the way we think about delivering services from government. The reality is, if you're in a private sector environment and you're running even a basically transparent, key performance indicator-driven business, you can figure out what are the key drivers of success in your business. You can share those with your team. You can be transparent about what the challenges are. You can ask people who are working in your team to provide their feedback around how things can be better for them better for the organization, and better for the end user, which in this case are patients and families. And it seems as if none of that is happening in our healthcare system. There is a fundamentally broken culture of fear. There's a culture of hiding information versus trying to fix issues. And there's a culture of political spin and gaslighting coming from the government that wants to convince people to disbelieve their lying eyes when they can see very well that our healthcare system is crumbling. We have to get serious about this. We have to actually start taking real action. We have to start being transparent. And I think one of the crucial things that I certainly am seeing time and again in my conversations with doctors and other frontline professionals, we have to start listening to the people who are the boots on the ground doing this work, respecting them, respecting their feedback, implementing the constructive solutions that they're trying to put forward, not shutting them down and leaving them in a position where they feel so ignored, so shut down, and so in fear of the folks that should be managing the system that they are instead going to the public via the media and having to go to MLAs in order to share feedback that should be able to be shared within the system and put to good use to make a better system that works for workers, that works for patients, and that works for the taxpayer.
It seems like such simple answers, like when we ask, how much did you spend in the UK? There's a checkbook. Somebody wrote a check. There's a checkbook. There's a number. Just say the number. And then what did we get in return for that? You know you tracked who showed up or didn't show up. And if it was zero, say we spent $2 million, we got nothing. And then maybe look at who made that decision and fire that person. Do you know what I mean? Like somebody suggested that idea and hold somebody accountable. What's that?
At a minimum, you spent $2 million and got nothing. Show us that you've recalibrated.
Yeah.
Show us that you learned from the experience of pissing away 2 million taxpayer dollars and getting nothing for it, and that you're switching your approach based on that. Don't lie and obfuscate and cover it up and try to avoid disclosing it if you're making mistakes and not learning them. For God's sake, we've got to make this system better. That has to start with being honest with ourselves, honest with the public, honest with the people that are working in the system and making life and death choices every day.
And I would say also that there should never be a one-pronged strategy. It should be like, like multiple-pronged strategy. Because in a business, you run a business, you don't have one strategy and hope for the best. And if that doesn't work out, you say, oh, well, that sucked, right? And close it up. You got to have multiple prongs. You don't rely on one thing. So if you're advertising in the U.S., don't go to step to the podium and talk about how that's your big solution. Because you got to have more things going on. Like this labor mobility seems like the easiest piece of fruit to pick, along with how do we convince the people that are already in market, convince them to come back to work. Those two seem like the easiest pieces.
Jim, it's those, and it's also go start talking to the people that are working in the system today. Start rebuilding trust. Start reopening communication. Start meeting with them and talking with them and acknowledging their frustration and hearing their ideas. Because I can tell you that's what I've been doing. For the last number of days, I've had a number of really great meetings with doctors. I have more scheduled. And you know what? When you sit down with these folks, they're not just there to complain. They're there to tell you how they think it could be better. And in some cases, they've been sharing those solutions and flagging those problems for a year or for 7 years. Yeah. And they haven't been heard. So there has to be a reset on that relationship to make sure that we're getting the most of the highly trained, passionate frontline healthcare professionals who are in the system to make the system better, to make it work for them so that they stay in the system, to bring people who have left the system back into the system. And if we're going to try to recruit people from abroad to come into the system, for God's sake, we've got to make sure that it is a system with a culture that they want to be part of.
And I'm going to cut the NDP a little bit of slack here. I'm going to say, if it's the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy lives on even when you change governments, if the bureaucracy is the problem, then have the guts and the courage to change the bureaucracy, to gut it, to cut off the beast or whatever and say, that's enough of this bureaucracy. We need change. Because the bureaucrats sometimes are the ones that cause the most problems because they won't change or they just drag their feet and do different things. And they're the ones that are raking in the big bucks. They're making more than you guys are making. And sometimes they're the problem. But it's the courage that the NDP has to have to actually do something, But they won't have any courage if they can't even at least be honest with what's going on.
Well, and to your point, Jim, you know what? Sometimes in any organization, a company, a health authority, sometimes it's about individuals, peoples. It can be toxic relationships, and sometimes it's just that the culture has gotten frozen. And if you have a culture that has become risk averse, or a culture that has become more focused on trying to hide problems than fix problems, then you're not going to get solutions. So, it's not some blanket chainsaw fire everyone. That's not what it is. What it is you've got to have culture change from the top on down, where from the premier to the health minister to the CEOs of the health authorities, you are signaling that we are acknowledging there is a problem. We are acknowledging there is a crisis. We are acknowledging that there is a culture problem and that people working in the system are not feeling heard. They are feeling that there is a culture of fear and a fear of retribution. We've got to change that. And you have to signal that. It's so broken that you have to signal that loud and clear and firm so that everyone all the way down the command chain from the premier on down gets the message that we are changing the way that we do healthcare in our province, and that we're going to start listening to the boots on the ground.
I would say that, when Premier Eby steps to the podium and what he has to say is that, they got a bunch of forms filled out, that they got nothing. That's what that says to me. To him, it might have sounded like, they had a big win there, and some of the media ate that up and pumped out stories and that. But that's a nothing burger, and it tells me that, they got nothing. And I think at this point in this, somebody has to be held accountable, and somebody needs to lose their job. And I think that's what the message should be. Somebody, a minister, someone, a bureaucrat, somebody, because we didn't get here today. We didn't get here last week. This is an ongoing issue that continually gets worse and keeps deteriorating. And it needs to be addressed because, it starts in Oliver and in Lillooet and 100 Mile House. And now it's a big sore thumb because it's Kelowna, right? Because it's all of a sudden got a lot of attention, right? Because, when Lillooet, nobody seems to pay any attention, but this is going to get some attention.
Yeah, and Jim, bottom line, yeah, sure, somebody needs to lose their job, and his name is David Eby.
Yeah, somebody needs to be held accountable, because this is not acceptable for British Columbians, or Canadians for that matter.
Exactly, right. And that, again, that's our job as elected officials, is to hold the government to account and to make sure that that's what we can do as opposition, right? I said this, I sat with a doctor the other day, and they asked, what can you do? And I said, look, what I can do is I can ask questions and I can amplify voices. We don't get to change the system as government. Our objective is to become a government in waiting so that we are afforded the opportunity by the people to get in there and to fix these problems. But as an opposition, what we can do is we can ask hard questions of the government. And importantly, especially right now in this moment, when we have a lot of healthcare professionals who are afraid of retribution, they are gathering strength in numbers. They're standing up for one another. Some of them are putting their names behind these statements. They're putting numbers behind these statements. But it's also the job of folks like myself in the legislature to amplify those voices and make sure that they are heard loud and clear by the government.
I have this message for Mr. Eby and the cabinet ministers that won't do interviews. They talk about Trump all the time. They use him as the villain and everything, and that's what they hide behind. They talk about Trump as being this big villain. But you know what he'll do? He'll sit down and do interviews with people he absolutely hates. He does an interview almost every day. And that's what this government does not do. They will not be held accountable. And for that, they are worse than him in that regard. They will not be held accountable. They will not do interviews. He'll do an interview with almost everybody. Like, you almost see an interview a day. You actually get overexposed to his narcissism and that. But at least he'll answer questions. And Eby and the cabinet ministers seem to be selectively deciding who they'll talk to. And even question period and then these bills that want to have crisis management all the time. I think with the Liberals and the NDP are living off this drug called crisis management.
I mean, look, I would describe the Eby government as being arrogant, ineffective, autocratic, and out of touch.
Yeah. I don't know. We can talk all day. I don't want to keep too much of your time. I know you got a big event to go to yet today. I do thank you for your time. The nice thing about you answer all the time, and you're willing to talk. You're willing to take questions. And I'd say that to the NDP and the Liberals that refuse to take questions or refuse to answer and make somebody wait months for an FOI. Like that in itself is your culture. You know, I'm going to share one last point with you. Ian, who used to work for the Daily Mail, and he also worked for the British government. and he answered mails. He said that was their culture, that they had to answer the emails right away. He just reached out to the U.S. State Department for a question. He got an answer in 15 minutes. Like Kelowna now reached out to the U.S. State Department, got an answer. We've reached out to the PMO's office time and time and time again, and we get nothing. We reach out to David Eby's, ministers, we get nothing. We get nothing. I guess we got an answer to this one. Like, no, there's no future opportunities. What does that mean? What is that supposed to mean?
Yeah, that's frustrating. I mean, I will just say on that note, I've been fortunate to have a bunch of frontline healthcare workers reaching out to my office over the last number of weeks. I've appreciated meeting with those folks, and certainly for anybody else that does want to meet, that does want to chat on that front, just Google me. I'm not hard to find. My email address is right on there. Send a note to my office, and we'll get a meeting set up. There's, frankly, just listening to these folks, I've had the opportunity to learn a ton about what's happening in the system, and it certainly has reinforced my belief that we need change.
The only way we're going to get stuff fixed if we make it uncomfortable for people. You know what I mean? Like, they got to get uncomfortable. They got to get comfortable being uncomfortable, because this is not going to get the attention it deserves if we just all, just wait for them to kind of come up with some type of solution. Anyway, I do thank you for your time. And
always a pleasure, Jim. Always a pleasure.
All right. And we do thank you for watching Now Media.